while Victor is fixing things, I just wanted to precise, I'm not a scientist, as you've heard. I'm only a conservator trying to cope with alterations on artworks. So this presentation will address conservation challenges in modern and contemporary art, but it's a sort of promenade with lots of images, pictures. It's not a very scientific talk. It's not at all a scientific talk. Yes. So Victor asked me to introduce you to the problems we cope with in, can you hear me? Yes. To problems we cope with in contemporary and modern art, but they are not so different from problems in ancient arts. And personally, I've been in the Centre Pompidou. I used to be a freelance conservator and work for the Louvre and other museums of ancient art. And most of the problems I've encountered and the alterations I've seen are similar to old paintings. And above all, because all artworks undergo those changes by natural evolution of materials. And what appears to us first are the mechanical degradation and all the optical changes. And of course, they may be accelerated or increased by various factors. And that's where, as conservators, we find very difficult sometimes to evaluate the factors, because in the context of museum, we are not always we don't have always the knowledge of what happened to the artwork before it went in the museum, or what has been his previous life. And so it's very difficult to make conclusions from what we know. The structural alterations, the structural changes with mechanical alterations phenomena, as I said, are very often identical in modern art and old art. Time is very often the key, because they don't appear immediately. Above all, what we call mechanical cracks. What I would like to say is that conservators, we have to do condition reports very regularly, and so we have our own language, which is not maybe a very correct language. So usually we make a distinction between what we call mechanical cracks and drying cracks. We call drying cracks as well premature cracks, you see, that happen more quickly. And mechanical cracks for us are linked to not only to the stresses coming from that appear from external solicitations, but also by the implementation of the artwork, how the artist has put the canvas on the stretcher, all the variations of climate, of course, relative humidity and temperature do matter. But generally speaking, we think that the relation between the support and the paint layer is decisive. That is, rigidity. If we have a very rigid film as a paint layer, on a reactive support like textile or wood, for instance, or cardboard sometimes, which moves with, can swollen or change in dimensions, and then this rigid layer after a while does crack because it's no longer elastic, like or wrinkles. Very often I explain to curators that cracks, they are like wrinkles. And lots of factors may increase this rigidity, like, for instance, having different layers, one on each other, according to the artist's technique. And, for instance, we've noticed very often that the thicker the layer, the more cracked it is. For instance, in this Zaovuki painting, you can see that the upper part is much more cracked because it's very thick, while the lower part is not cracked at all because it's a very sort of glaze, very light glaze, very liquid. So thickness does matter a lot. And of course, all those artists who have used very thick paint layers get a very stiff material, which is not adapted to a supple support. Oh, sorry. Some artists, we have a very interesting case here with Balthus. Sorry.
No, it's my bad. I think this thing is very bad.
Technology.
Excuse-moi.
No, that's all right. Balthus, yes. Yes, Balthus is a very interesting artist because in his the first part of his career, he was a very classical painter using classical layers of paint, oil paint, very traditional, very much like 19th century technique. And then he went to the Villa Médicis, where he became the head of the Villa Médicis. And while he was there, he decided to restore the frescoes of the Villa Médicis. And he got completely fascinated by the mural technique. And he tried to use the mural, include the mural technique in a canvas. And so the result is there that from this period, all Balthus paintings are very much cracked because he has integrated different things in the oil, including sometimes lime. And he has also used very thick type of painting, and it's a disaster mechanically. Other type of artist who uses extreme technique is Kiefer. You know that Kiefer includes lots of things in his paintings, and the cracks appear almost immediately. For instance, this artwork has been both recently required. It's quite a recent artwork, and it's already, as you see, very much cracked because all sorts of objects are stuck on the surface, and the stress is enormous on the paint. Fujita is also a very, very interesting painter because Fujita, being Japanese, has mixed the Asiatic technique with Occidental technique. And as you know, he's a very brave designer, and he loves using brushes to highlight the outlines of his characters, and he needs to have a very smooth surface. And to get this smooth surface, Fujita has very, very thick preparations. He uses lead white in his preparations, and Fujita are also among the most cracked paintings we have because of this very thick, rigid underlayer. And we know also that there is this creation of a soap between the lead white and the oil, which may also increase the rigidity of the paint film. The environmental factors are very difficult for us to evaluate. We know there is aging, but there's also transport, vibrations, and climate control. And there are accidents or manipulations which can end up by cracks. And the Centre Pompidou is a very generous museum, and so there are lots of loans, and our artworks travel a lot. Above all, modern art. And during those travels, very often the climate control is not warranted, and those masterpieces we have in modern art are very much cracked, as for instance this beautiful cross, You see the background of it, but also a Mondrian. I took this example because the Mondrian we have are very much cracked, and they have traveled a lot. And I paid a visit to a colleague in the Peggy Guggenheim Museum last year, and I've been able to see that their Mondrian, they have two Mondrians, but it's not cracked at all. And so of the same period. But we know that in Peggy Guggenheim Museum, they take care of the artworks because it's not a very big collection, and the collection doesn't travel that much neither. And they have those measures, conservative measures like face protections and back protections, and they cover, in the evening, they cover the artworks to prevent the light on them. And then maybe, that's just a question I asked myself, maybe all those measures have had an effect, while our poor masterpieces have not had the same luck, actually, in their life. What are more difficult to understand or interpret are the local cracks, actually. You see, when we have cracks of that type, it's more difficult to make a diagnose. Vibrations are also crucial in what happens with artworks. For instance, in those very, very thick impasto, vibrations are fatal, and after a while they break, the impasto breaks. And some cracks, so we think, but that's a conservator's interpretation. When we have circular cracks, very often we consider that they may be linked to accidental impact. For instance, we may have had a dent before, and later on we may have this type of crack, but it's very difficult to prove. We have not been in collecting the informations. We don't have this very scientific approach which allows to be certain of what we say. So that's why I think in the future some projects might be carried out to help us precise things. And here you see on the right, there's a break which is accidental of a painting which has fallen down. The second type I mentioned are the drying cracks. So usually they are linked to the superposition of oily layers, and they mean a retraction of the upper layer. Drying cracks, very often they appear on selective pigments as well, like the black or the brown. And we think maybe it's because they need more oil to start with, but they are more absorbing, and so maybe they dry, the upper layer dries much more before the underlayer. And then when the underlayer retracts, there's this very strong stress. This is an example of a color, a specific color, having this type of cracks which don't appear on the rest of the painting. And very often also we have them on the strong reliefs, strong impasto, you see, and in the end the impasto comes off and stand out from the support by retraction. What is difficult, I think, is to characterize really those cracks, because when we make those condition reports, we have to say mechanical crack or drying crack, but they may be both, really. It's really, it's not very, so much precise or evaluation, because, of course, with time, we consider that stable cracks are more the drying cracks type, but sometimes you have both phenomenon, really, I think. The loss of adhesion is the most common alteration we have in paintings, and it's about 80% of our treatments. It is fixing treating the loss of adhesions, and there's been very interesting studies Alain Roche, for instance, made an engineer, wrote different books about the stress leading to appearing of cracks, and they're very interesting. But what we see from his book, his research, is that there is more stress at the surface than in the depth of a painting. And of course, the adhesion between the different layers is very important between the preparation and the support itself, then between the paint layer and the preparation, and between the paint layers themselves. And so you see, we all very often have this type of situation of lack of adhesion, which is not always linked to cracks, but more to a sort of lack of grip between the underlayer, the preparation or the underlayer, and the surface. So this is a Mathieu and Joan Michel on the right part. You see, and another from Mathieu. You see the impasto has totally disappeared, and in some parts it has also taken away the preparation. But here, for instance, you don't have any crack, and nevertheless, there is no adhesion between the paint layer and the preparation. And in this case, we know that the painting has been soaked, so there's a factor of humidity, probably soaking the preparation. Some artists have used an appropriate support. For instance, Georges Rouault has made some paintings on rhodoid. And the problem we have is that those sheets of rhodoid are very often mounted like drawings. That is, they're mounted in a supple way on a ground, on a cardboard ground. And therefore, the rhodoid is still supple and moves a lot. And as there is very little adherence between the paint layer, which is very thick, and this moving support, we get those cleavages everywhere. And this is a case we find very difficult to solve. At the moment, we are trying to understand how we can change this process and fix correctly those flakes. It's very, very difficult on that type of support to find the right protocol. And sometimes the modern artists, don't use preparation. And here there's just a gluing of the canvas, but no real preparation. And of course, there's too much a difference between what is called the low stress of the canvas glue, of the glue on the canvas, and the thickness of the impasto, which have much more stress inside. And the trouble is that you see flaking does appear when there's a certain type of cracks, and irregular loose tension may also increase the mobility of the support and induce stress in the film. We also have these cases like here, Masson, this painting by Masson. Masson has mixed the oil with sand, and there's very little adhesion between sand and oil, and so we regularly have losses of sand, and each time the painting is lent, we have to make it travel flat, and we have to check and have a fixing treatment of the sand. The surface damages, so this second part, are more linked to matte surfaces. That's where modern art and contemporary art is different from old art, ancient art, because surfaces very often are matte. And you all know, of course, that matte is this relation between the quantity of pigment and of medium. And so we have powdery and brittle surfaces. This is one problem. It means that when we want to clean the paintings, because they are, of course, they receive pollutants on the surface, they accumulate pollutants, and then it's very difficult to remove those pollutants because they are not very cohesive, but the paint layer has no cohesion either, so it's different to make a difference between the two. And every treatment is susceptible of dissolving the paint, you see, by taking away pigments. We have chemical modifications problem with migration of components producing optical changes. This is the case we are studying also at the moment. Efflorescences are one of the deposits we have. In this field, actually, there's been very interesting studies carried out. Pauline de la Grandière is a conservator who's been interested in soulage years ago, and she carried out research in 2006 about some soulage painting who had efflorescences. And for instance, you have here on the painting which is kept in Toulouse. On the left side, you have those dripping and white blanching, and on the right part, you have the UV examination of this surface. And it's a very interesting study because she has been able to collect information about the artist technique, about the manufacturers. He used to buy his materials too, and she's been able this way to understand some of the reasons why we have those efflorescences. And then her study has been enlarged to other artists of the same period of the 60s, and it has been found that artists like Mathieu also may have those problems. They have those deposits which are looking under microscope like little needles, crystallizations. And usually we treat, when we have this type of problem, we treat it with a soft brush. We are brushing out those blanching, those efflorescences. Here another type, you see here, under a microscope you can see it, crystallization, deposit of fatty acid. She made these remarks that about the soulage, that the paint is soft and considered not dry, but it has cracks that evolved in lifts between the preparation and the pictorial layer. And the role of preparation and the impact of non-absorbent nature, as well as interaction with the oily medium. And so, as I told you, she's been able to show that there's a link with the supplier, the material supplier, because it was called Lefebvre-Foinet, is still a supplier. And during this very strict period of during the war, just after the war, there was little lead white left on the market, Cerus. And so he also, having had a discussion with some of his employees, actually, he discovered that one of his employees had modified a little the recipe, and that might be the reason why we have those problems now. So that's interesting to connect history with phenomenon. Exudates and yellowing, this is another interesting case. It's a painting by Riopel. And Riopel paintings are very thick material. And in the white, we have seen gradually appearing those yellow lines, which are accumulation of exudates, but becoming very yellow. And it's very disturbing because those surfaces were supposed to be plain white, actually. And I had a discussion with a Canadian conservator, as there was an exhibition taking place in Quebec with Riopel, and he explained me that Riopel used already saw this phenomenon appearing, and he used to put his paintings outside in the sun during summer to get white back, actually, and it worked. So he thought that UV exposition would be benefit to resolve this problem. So I think maybe it could be interesting to carry out an experimentation with very precise measures, actually, but on this type of problem. Sticky surfaces are also a nightmare. They are a nightmare because they are everything sticks to it. They are very difficult to protect. They pick up all the dust, and the dust is very complicated to remove because what the dust does, it does a print. So when you have very smooth surfaces like that, which should be very neat, very smooth, you have prints. Even if you remove those dust, you keep a print of the dust on the surface, which is really, really terrible. And here you see another Etel Adnan painting where you have also all those different fibers and sticking to the surface. What I call unintended drips and drops, because also it's a phenomenon we have in our collection of those paintings evolving. They are also called, I like the word, it's not mine, but I like it, weeping paint. I like it. So you see the surface of the work is covered with either drops or more generalized dripping, and they are yellow, still very sticking. Some are really liquid, becoming liquid. What's interesting is that this phenomenon doesn't appear immediately. It appears after a certain time. It's not, for instance, this is a case we have in our storage, which has to be kept flat. It's a painting by Mez, and I know some research has been done abroad about Mez. Well, I got in touch with the artist myself, but I didn't get many information, except he told me my painting is living. But it's a problem because you see, we discovered that because the painting was kept nicely with a polyethylene film, and we noticed those dripping on the polyethylene film. We have measured also, we have made drawings of the evolution then, because we have studied the painting, and you see every time we turn in a different position the painting, we get different directions of the drippings. And so when you touch it, it's very sticky. What is interesting is that it concerns only one color, actually a sort of golden yellow color, but not the whole surface, which has been studied, Autopienne also, which has the same, as you see, same problem. So it does modify really in a very unexpected way the composition of the artist and its problems for keeping the artwork. And so we don't know really how to solve that, above all when it has this type of aspect. In this case, this is a Chinese painter, and you see also all those transparent golden also shapes around the composition. They were not originally included in the composition. They appeared later, about 6-7 years later. And in this case, actually, it's more easy to solve, let's say, because as it's very thin, we can dissolve. What we do actually is dissolving this product, this exudate, I don't know how you can call that, with solvents. but it can reappear again. Something I've noticed personally also is that some artists who have used Venice turpentine mixed up with oil, after about 5-6 years, they have drippings as well. And there's a famous recipe given by Salvatore Dali about the interesting use of Venice turpentine, and some artists who have tried to imitate this, use this recipe, have had this type of problems. Let's see. Here. Well, specific techniques give sometimes also very specific surface aspects. For instance, the fact that Picasso has started to use Ripollin very early, as well as Kandinsky, Aux Enfants, Le Corbusier, is the beginning of the use of industrial paint. And industrial paint also, for us, is also would be very interesting to study, because we know there are all those different types of painting, glycerophthalic, alkyd. We don't really know how to recognize them, identify them nowadays. I mean that when we have to make a report, a condition report, sometimes we think this can be alkyd because it's very dense and looks like oil, but more watery type of medium. But you see, there are appreciations, they are not very precise things. And it would be important for us to have more information about the composition of those new mediums, because they are very much used by contemporary American artists. So industrial and Ripollin, they give those wrinkling aspect to some of the paintings you see. Here you have wrinkling, and you also have this drop there, this liquid part coming out of the skin, because they make a superficial skin, which is very soft, and inside sometimes you have non-dried liquid. Another nightmare is the mixture of wax with oil. And it's nightmare because it's a very specific finish, which should be perfect and matte. And once it has been touched, then we have not succeeded till now to find a solution to remove, you see, those glossy stains. So we are really looking for solutions. Varnishes are an interesting problem, varnishes, because, well, unlike old masters' paintings, we know that contemporary and modern painters didn't like their paintings to be varnished. But because they have an optical incidence on the artwork. But very often in our collection, for instance, almost all the modern paintings are varnished. We have no information about this varnishing. We don't know, for instance, you see the difference here. I've been cleaning Modigliani, painting by Modigliani. All our Modigliani have been varnished. So they are covered with natural resin varnishes, so easy to remove, but having a very strong yellowing tendency with time. And most of the time we can prove that the varnishes are not original if they cover retouches, for instance, restorations. But what we don't know is, you see here, you see inside it's a detail from microscope by Anaïs Gentil, who's been carrying out a research about Modigliani in the CDRMF, and you see all these crackled and yellowed varnish. Why are they being applied? To saturate the colors, to correct matte or blanched areas. Very often in restoration, in the past, you see when you cleaned a painting with very strong solvents, you got, we call that chancy, a blanching effect on the surface for different reasons. And the solution to treat that was to cover with a varnish. So very often varnishes have been used by conservators to correct blanched areas after restorations. And they can have been used also just because they wanted an intermediate layer between the paint layer, original paint layer, and retouching. And they can have been also applied to replace a varnish which could have been applied by the artist himself. And this is the question, personally interests me a lot, this question, but has no answer till now. It's very difficult to know exactly when a painting has been originally varnished or not in modern art. And in Modigliani cases, for instance, after this symposium and this research, we've heard that, we have read that in some letters, Modigliani precised he wanted to use varnish to have a sort of transparent effect. We know also from his collectors that some of his paintings had been varnished, but we don't have very precise information about that. So it's always, when we clean, even nowadays, when we clean those paintings, we don't know if we have to put a varnish. We have techniques to avoid the blanching after solubilization of varnishes, so it's not a problem of correcting that, but we never know what the finish should be exactly, because when you have a varnish, of course, the differences in material of the different touches, you see the technique of the artist does disappear because it's evened by the varnish. So that's a real question. Varnishes are terrible when they've been applied by conservators on matte paintings. I say they are irreversible because if you see this Artum painting, it's very, very, very thin. It's a sort of glaze. You see, it's the abrasions of the surface. You see, it's a very, very. The background is painted like that with a sort of glaze, really. So when you have a varnish on top of that, if you try to remove it, you remove the paint as well. It's really, really difficult to remove that. Another example of irreversible varnishing is the Tête Rouge by Modigliani. It has been painted on cardboard with blue paper, and the blue color is inside the paper. It's a tint of the paper, and it is varnished, and it has a greenish tint, greenish nuance on the background. When we started to study this artwork, we discovered under the paper along the edges that there was an unvarnished part, unvarnished ring, much more blue, actually. So the idea was to try to find this blue back by removing the varnish. Unfortunately, though we have worked with nanogel to avoid any penetration of the solvents, you see we managed to remove, as you see here on the test, we managed to remove the varnish without getting the blue back, because there's been modification, not only absorption of the cellulose fibers by the varnish, but also probably chemical modification, which gives this very greenish color, or at least not so. You see in the left part of the slide, you see this very deep blue and bright blue on the left, and the test is much more grayish. Synthetic varnishes, acrylic emulsions, have been very much used abroad in the States, and sometimes they are incompatible, they don't stick to the oil paint. So this is another example. You see this varnish crackling and also flaking. So you can peel it off, you see, and it's another type of operation which I've carried out, taking lots of time because I've been able to swallow the varnish, but I had to remove it completely because there was no adhesion at all to the oil. And I say plain, I end up with this artist who has Picabia, because Picabia, as I think he's been playing with varnishes. Picabia, as you know, loves painting over other previous paintings he's made, playing with that. And this is the aspect of one of his paintings nowadays, and I was wondering if this was done on purpose, this retraction of the varnishes on the surface, which creates this very odd effect of a net in front of the face of this woman, or is it non-calculated and accidental? So that's very difficult to find out. So my conclusion is that, like in human being diseases, correct diagnosis and research prior to treatment are essential, of course, for us. A major step for contemporary art would be to characterize precisely the medium, the components, and the technical implementation of artworks, which we can't do conservators if we don't share and collaborate with scientists. And study cases, this is my very conclusion, is that study cases are very necessary for the understanding of alteration and the possible solutions for treatment. And I'm referring to this study case carried out by Pauline de la Grandière on Soulage, because I think they allow us to have information collected from scientists, art historians, and other conservators. And it's the only way through a study case that we can then enlarge the knowledge, and maybe from this case, you see, of the Soulage, it has been possible to make links with other painters and understand the whole process of those exudates. And I think that's the method we should use, conservators, is to focus on study cases and make research develop around them.